Well, hello, everybody. We haven't done one of these in a few weeks. We are back. And as you will note, neither Jen nor I are where we normally are. The funny thing is, normally I'm in Toronto and she's elsewhere. Now she's in Toronto and I'm elsewhere. Jen, I don't want to poke fun. I do a little bit. You've had a relaxing vacation. So a couple weeks ago, you were
Yes.
coming to Toronto and you were very excited. You were telling me all the things you're going to be doing when you were going here. And
Yep.
then what actually happened?
Oh, well, I just had the best vacation of my life. Just like it's been unmitigated fantasticness, let me tell you. So, firstly, my grandmother died. So I had to fly the kids out to Toronto and then fly back to Vancouver for the funeral, give the eulogy, which of course I was very honored to do. Then fly back out to Toronto in time to do a big party for my in-laws, which was then canceled because they all got COVID, and then my husband got pneumonia.
Pneumonia separate from the COVID, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, well, no, we know it was bacterial pneumonia because like the giant antibiotics he's been taking really cleared it up. So it's been great, been good fun, been great taking care of the kids in Toronto with like 30 plus degree heat plus the humidex. That's awesome when you have a redhead who does not tolerate heat.
It's
So I've
been
kind of
it's been like high
unable to take it anywhere.
30s. It's been high 30s or 40 in Toronto for the
Yeah,
last week.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Which, by the way, is too hot to do anything. Like I can't take a 2-year-old redhead out to a pool
you can't take a
in
2-year-old out in that. My kids,
35, 4 or 5, 35-year-old, 35 degree heat. Like that's just too much.
you can do stuff with older kids, but I know what you mean. I would not have taken my 2-year-old out in that kind of heat either. Look, there's no good time for you to have lost your grandmother, which obviously sucks, but the
I mean,
timing of it,
the good time would have been like 4 or 5 years ago when she first started to lose her mind. That would have been the good time.
or even more directly than that, you had just flown across 2 time zones and then had to immediately fly
Yeah,
back
yeah,
across 3 time zones
yeah,
and then come back the original 3 time zones to meet up with
yeah,
your family where they
yeah,
actually were. So
yeah,
you've been crisscrossing North America.
yeah. I'm having a great time.
Well, I repeat my advisory that you take next week off and I can run the shop here. But we're only at half publication schedule anyway. Not much is happening.
I think I should be able to do like the dispatch next week. That should be fine. That's
We'll do
not
a
onerous by
dispatch.
any
That's fine.
stretch.
And
Yeah.
I'll pop up a couple columns. Um, I wanna mention something that you and I had actually been talking about a couple of days ago. So you're grumpy. I mean, you're
No,
you're tilting now.
I'm like I try to be stoic about these sorts of things. So like I have no real emotional state toward any of it, but like uh, on principle, I'm in a foul fucking mood. Just a foul mood.
I I'm kind of like you then. When I'm under like intense pressure, I don't get angry. I get like
Just
compressed.
cold.
Yeah.
Just like yeah, yeah. That's where I am. Like I'm like the full on. This is sociopath face. Is what's happening here.
I want to discount a little bit what I'm about to repeat you telling me because you're grumpy, and I think that's a
Mhm.
discount here. But you had actually made an interesting observation about my hometown, about how it's growing so fast, it's falling apart a bit.
Yeah, I mean
You've lived in
this
Toronto
is.
before, like
Oh yeah, I
you.
lived in Toronto, and I gotta say, like, as much as I give Toronto hell, I give Toronto hell in the same way that I give Edmonton hell. It's more out of principle and sort of a tribal allegiance to Calgary than it is any dislike of Toronto. I
The
actually
same
love
reason I
Toronto.
hate Ottawa and Hamilton.
Yeah, yeah, correct. It's the correct thing to do. It's just like cheering for your sports team, right? But truth be told, I really like Toronto. I love this place. I love the aesthetic of Toronto. I love like the brick buildings, which we don't have out west, like, because of course, they don't ship brick west. You make all the brick here in sort of central Canada. So like we don't have these sorts of old school Edwardian brick building things. Like I love that aesthetic. I love how kind of just slightly worn around the edges and lived in everything feels. I love the layout of the communities. I love being like the way that you've got like these residential communities next to the subway lines. I think that's fantastic. Again, when you get out west, they don't build cities that way, and it's a very different vibe and a very different aesthetic. And there's tons of stores and shops I love here. I love a lot of the restaurants. So there's so much that I like. And then I'm like, oh, I really wish I could live in Toronto. And then I do the math on it. I'm just like, this house I'm staying in, which to me would be worth $500,000, would be a $500,000 house. It would go for 2.5 million. I can't justify that. Like I just can't justify the sacrifice and quality of life that would entail. And then you start doing the math on it, and you're like, okay, well, in addition to the math, like, what would my life, what would my kids' lives be like? I'm just going like, I couldn't just like send them out and run around and come back at dark in this neighborhood, could I? I was like, no, you couldn't. And then you start looking around, it's like, it's pretty dirt. I mean, the heat's not helping anything, but like, there's trash everywhere. It's dirty. It smells bad, and like, okay, like, I had the great classic TTC experience where somebody got into a fight and fell onto the subway train, and they had to stall the subway train, and there were a couple of homeless people who took off their shoes and things like that. I was like, that's just the city living, whatever, you deal with that, that's not a big deal, I can live with it. Anyway, sorry, we're back.
No, we're back after a brief parenting delay, but
yeah.
So you were actually talking about the subway experience.
Yeah, so the subway experience, and like I lived here, I was used to that. Me, it was just it was just there, and then a couple of just middle-aged women wearing masks, the type, middle-aged women wearing masks, like they ostentatiously removed themselves from my son's presence because my son is autistic and he was kind of like acting weird, and like, so they were like like like, I'm just going like, oh, and you just and then I don't know, you go into these super expensive neighborhoods that are so beyond anything I could ever afford to live in, that used to be sort of in places that I used to think of like as not even being Toronto. They're so far out from downtown, and now they're so expensive that you couldn't imagine living here. And like, nobody's done maintenance on any of these $2 million houses. Like, they're all falling apart. Like, they're obviously falling apart. Like, nobody's done basic painting. No one's done the obvious repair. So like, you have the overwhelming sense of like a city that's that's starting to like fall apart at the edges, or a city that's just massively overextended, in these places paying absurd amounts of money to live. And that's just kind of my observation of this place, is like as much as there's a part of me that would love to be 25 again and living in Toronto and just like living this life and then like enjoying and soaking up this aesthetic, I can't imagine it at 38 with 2 young children and a budget. Like, I can't wrap my head around it. I really can't.
I find it interesting because I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think I told you before, it really depends on exactly where you are.
Oh, totally. But yeah, your neighborhood is rich, like it's different.
I think it's partially that, but it's also the age of the neighborhood, it's the composition of the neighborhood. So what now exists in Toronto are hundreds of thousands of multimillionaires in terms of their land value who don't have the cash flow on a month-to-month basis to get the landscaping done. Yeah. And it wouldn't stand out to you. Like, if I took you through a neighborhood where the paint wasn't current and there were some weeds on the lawn, and it was like a solidly middle-class neighborhood, you'd go, okay, makes sense. But then when you're going through an area that is 3 times out of your housing budget, and the houses are a bit, they're not in bad shape, but they need a little TLC. Like, it's like, I'm up here today because our house is getting fixed. It's getting painted and cleaned on the outside. We've already had the landscapers come through. Toronto, it's an interesting time to live in Toronto. And I know enough of the history of other big cities to recognize what Toronto is happening. It's becoming a really big, dense, rich city, but it's still run like a small 1950s suburb. Our institutions are out of step with the reality of the city, and people like it that way, right? So you've got this hyper dense Manhattanizing downtown core. It's a great place to be. And then you've got far-flung inner suburbs, we call them, because it's still in the 416, but they're suburban areas, and they're nice places to be, but they're not at all alike. And the political governance there, the level of services requirement, oftentimes the age of the infrastructure. One of the reasons downtown Toronto works fairly well now, relatively speaking, in terms of its infrastructure, because we replaced a lot of it in the last 30 years. Then you start getting out in those suburbs, that stuff's World War II vintage. And in my neighborhood about 3 or 4 years ago, it was like a year-long traffic nightmare because we had to rip up every road in sequence and replace the water mains. Now that they're replaced, they're going to be good for another 50, 100 years, but that work had to be done because that stuff was 1940s vintage. So like, this is the problem we have here. I don't think the listeners, the viewers, or even the readers in Dispatch, I don't think they're going to care much about like Ontario. Like Doug Ford says he wants to give strong mayor powers to the Ottawa and Toronto mayors. I don't know how I feel about this. I want to actually look what the proposal is, but no one can argue the governance in these cities is working well. Ottawa epically beclowned itself during the occupation, the siege, because I remember watching some of their meetings, right? And that was actually like that was like you and I have never downplayed this. Like we think the Emergencies Act might have been a stretch, but we've never downplayed it was a problem. And you had the most bumpkin-esque, provincial in a bad way, local councilors being like the people trying to handle this. They were completely outclassed. And then you look at Toronto, where we can't even figure out, like the mayor a couple months ago, rightly so, was angry and demanding change. Not another report. I want change, because we can't get our bathrooms in civic parks open in time. So, like, someone like this is an institutional problem we have it a lot in this country. Calgary is probably going to do better because, relatively speaking, it's a younger city. You just haven't run into some of these problems yet.
No, and Calgary doesn't have the hyper densification issues. I mean, Calgary has some of the infrastructure issues, but I mean, like to some extent, Calgary is a suburban city. It just is. Like you go to Calgary to buy a nice big house in the suburbs that you can raise your kids comfortably in. That's why you go and you live there and that house for $500,000. So, you know, I will still say this, that if you were picking a place to raise your kids in this country, I don't think right now that you can beat Calgary. I honestly think the value for money proposition for young families is so far ahead in Calgary. Well, until our political situation completely implodes, which it might do imminently, which we'll get into in a minute. But like, I still think the value for money, if you know, unless you're coming into this conversation with serious amounts of family money, like multi-million dollars in family money, Calgary is still a really, really great place to raise your kids.
I would say,
But
from what
it's
I
a suburban
hear,
city. It's a suburban city. Like I don't live within walking distance of 5 restaurants. Like
yeah,
that's just, I just don't. Now with kids, do I care? Not really. Like, I'm not taking my kids to a restaurant without like taking some beta blockers first nowadays. So like that's not happening. You know, and I do have access to transit. It's just not easy transit. You know what I mean? Like and I do have access to shopping, but it's like it's my closest is a big box store, and I got to drive to it. You know, like it's a suburban city. It's just what it is, and you accept those compromises and those trade-offs. And I come to a city like Toronto, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool. This is so funky. This is so neat. This is so nice. But at the same time, I'm just not insensitive to the extraordinary financial, and psychological trade-offs that living in Toronto entails. It's just it's not. I, you know, for where I am at my point in my life, it's not an easy sell.
my kids are about 5 years older than yours, and it's
Yeah.
different. Like
Yeah.
like so you said I don't have like 5 restaurants in easy walking distance. I'm thinking about it. I think I've got like 20.
Yeah.
Like,
You
I'm
get
not
like 20.
like,
Yeah.
do you count fast food, or do you
Sure.
want like
Yes.
sit down family restaurants?
Sure. I would count like, okay, so if in walking distance, I probably have 2 or 3 like decent little family, you know, decent burger place. I got a decent like Chinese food place. I got decent, you know what I mean? Like I got like 2 or 3, I would say.
By that metric, I'd have 15 or 20, and
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
difference of
That's the
density.
difference. Yeah.
But here's the thing: 5 years ago, when my son, like my son's my younger child, when he was much younger, we weren't walking to the local
Yeah, you're
family
not
burger place. Like,
walking. Yeah, you're not doing that.
like the lifestyle you have now suits where you are as a family now. Now
Yeah.
that my son can walk, likes trying new foods, is excited to try new things, that's when you start actually getting the value of all of this. But
Yeah.
when your kids are little, especially when they're really little, they're slugs that need to be fed and bathed.
Yeah.
Like, so yeah, we lived in the 905 when my daughter was young and when my son was born, and it was perfect because we had convenience. We had the big box store we could easily drive to. We like where we are now
You've
for a
got
lot
young
of
kids.
reasons.
What you need is IKEA and you need Walmart, man. Like that's just
Yeah.
what that's your life, right? And
Yeah.
I will say this is like I've now got very easy access to a major provincial park, like which means I mean I can literally just walk, and I'm in a huge provincial park, and it's glorious. Like it's absolutely glorious to be able to like that's what I do use with my kids. Like I go into a provincial park, and when they get up or when they get a little older, I'm gonna be like, go play in the park, come back at dark. Like I don't worry about it, you know. But
It's
anyway,
the main thing I worry about, though, in general, and this is something we write about a lot in the line. Actually, we're not good at fixing problems in this
no.
country. Like we I think have. I don't want to say this in an apocalyptic way. I think we've outgrown a lot of our institutions, but they're hard to change.
Yeah.
So there's no problem Toronto has right now that hasn't been fixed in some other city that's about 50 to 100 years older. So
So
that's
it's in
kind
this
of
weird transitional growing pains phase.
you know what, having grown up here, I can see it. If
Yeah.
I like when I'm driving around the city, I'm focused on the road. When I'm in a cab or an Uber looking around the city, I'm always like, whoa, there's
Where'd
more
that come
stuff
from?
here now.
Yeah.
This place is big, and it's very hard to manage that transition, right? Because millions of people want to live here, and we're not building housing, so the cost of everything has gone completely insane. I think that will come down partially because of our economic woes and partially because eventually we will build more housing. But basically, it's we talked about this before. This is like a bite and hold strategy. My wife got in at a good time, and you'll have to drag us out. Hopefully, 30 or 40 years from now, things will be better. So, what else do we want to talk about? Like
So
for
I mean, just
dispatch
for time,
purposes,
the strong mayor system, by the way, I actually do think it's probably a good idea for Toronto. I think it probably
I
does
think so
make
too.
sense.
On balance, I think so too.
And
I
it
want to
does
see the
sort of seem
plan.
like there's a degree of sort of Doug Ford derangement syndrome where people are just, you know, if a progressive mayor had proposed this, as progressive mayors have done in the past, you know, the same people who are now screaming about it would probably be all for it.
Well, one of
So
the people currently screaming about it is a former progressive mayor who had
yeah,
formerly proposed this, but
yes,
Doug Ford proposes it and it's bad.
yeah.
I said on a local radio show this week, I I have every expectation that Doug Ford will find a way to fuck this up. So I want to see the
Oh, he's got a
execution
gift
of
for
it,
that. Yes.
but
But
the
I will also
idea
say like
is
that. I
fine.
will say this, that when he cut Toronto City Council in half in the middle of a municipal game, we both you and I would both agree, bad fucking form, like
Yeah.
bad process, bad form, whatever. People were screaming about this like this was the beginning of tyranny, and like within a year, no one cared anymore, and everything continued on as it did.
Well, and
You
within a
know,
year, the Supreme Court goes, yeah, that's legal.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
legal. Moving on, like you know, so I don't know. It's kind of interesting that's you know, perhaps Doug Ford might have a couple of useful ideas for how to manage municipal reform. I don't know. I would just like this is one slight sliver of an area where I might give him a slight benefit of the doubt.
I think the one thing people who do not live in Toronto might not appreciate, and actually this is true of a lot of big cities. I don't know if it's true of medium-sized cities as much. Our lefties, like our municipally engaged lefties, either on council or kind of in the urban politics sphere, our lefties are actually extremely conservative. Like they are
Mm.
so resistant to change. They are so captured by the institutions. Our left wing progressives are some of the most conservative people in this city. They just don't realize it. They're this city needs change, and I am a true conservative. Like I don't mean that in a partisan sense, but I'm very wary of blowing up institutions because I don't trust. Call me Irish, but I don't believe in cooler heads prevailing. I'm very skeptical to break something because I normally assume what replaces it will be worse. But you look at the way Toronto functions today, we need to do something. So, anyway, look, we're chatting a lot about this stuff in large part because even though we've been off for a couple of weeks, it's been relatively quiet in the news. Like, there's not, I wouldn't say there's like a burning lead story in the country right now. The Pope's coming next week. Okay,
Oh,
maybe we'll talk about that next week.
that's an interesting. Actually, I think that's actually very interesting. And one of the places that he's planning to visit is lots of visits to First Nations communities, particularly ones that have been struggling. I mean, Massachusetts is one of the places that he's going to visit. This is probably an area better known as Habima, known for being notoriously violent and dealing with such a bad reputation on its violence front that it actually changed its name. So it's his visit to there is going to be really interesting. It does a sort of an Alberta centric visit. I think he's going there, but Alberta, is that right?
I honestly don't know.
don't know. So anyway, this is a big deal. The Pope visiting is a very, very big deal, particularly for religious people, and the focus on First Nations issues is and First Nations locations is also really interesting to me. Just clearly an attempt to sort of reach out and reconcile uh, obvious past injustices and wrongs.
I
What
know
would
you're
be
an atheist, but are
interesting?
you nominally Catholic?
Oh yeah, I was raised Catholic. Yeah,
Yeah.
raised, confirmed to Saint Cecilia, the whole deal.
I'm generic Toronto WASP, right?
Yeah, so you're like
So
an Anglican.
United technically.
Mm,
But I think I don't think I'm much more religious than you are.
no.
But I think I've been telling people kind of like who are like, hey, we'll have Matt like as a columnist come on our panel and talk about this. What do you think about the Pope's visit? I'm saying I'm not Catholic and I'm not Indigenous. I hope he has a nice stay. Like
Yeah,
I'm not invested in this. Like I
yeah.
know that there's a lot riding on this for a couple of groups. Obviously, Canadian Catholics are going to be really engaged. Some of Canada, Canadian Indigenous groups are going to be very engaged in this. Indigenous Canadians are going to be, some of them, very engaged about this. Some of them aren't. And it's just sort of like, all I hope happens when the Pope visits is that people who need healing get it.
Yeah, I mean, my concern with something like this is that it's also there's nothing that he's ever going to be able to say or do that will ever be enough,
No,
right? Like there's a bit of that, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't do it, right?
yeah, and hopefully some people benefit from it. Like
Yeah,
if I had a better solution or demand to make, I'd make it, but I don't. So
yeah.
I hope the people
So
who are directly bound up in this benefit.
politically, I think it would be very interesting to see whether or not the prime minister actually has an encounter with the Pope. I mean, one of the big rumors in Alberta politics was that the reason why Jason Kenney decided to stay on as premier after he
Be the Pope.
resigned was literally to the Pope. We know that Jason Kenney is actually a very devout Catholic. But I mean, one of the things, I mean, just as an aside, is that I would say is that there are lots of people in this country who are quite genuinely religious. And religion plays a very significant role in how they conceive of their lives and their politics. And that fact is one that is ignored or underplayed by a largely secular media culture. That would be my observation, is that the degree to which this stuff is important really gets misunderstood because most people in media are atheists, and they're
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, right? Because something I've written whole essays about is how the media criticism, the criticism made of the media that we're biased is often wrong. What we are is isolated. We're like we are like we have a bias. It's not technically inaccurate, but our bias is not born of an agenda so much it is born of worldview.
yeah.
And the media in this country is lopsidedly very well educated urbanites.
Well-educated urbanites from a particular social and economic class.
That's changing maybe a little bit, but
That's
I'm not
changing a
sure
little
which
bit.
way it's changing.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, hello there, ginger baby. It's getting harder to do this work unless you have a relatively stable economic background.
That's right.
And that could be family money. It could be being married to someone who made better career choices than we did. It can mean different things, but so the media is becoming, in some ways, like we talk a lot about diversity in the media, right? The media is going to gradually become more diverse. It will track Canadian demographics probably on a generational delay. People get really freaked out about this. I don't. Like every large institution will lag demographically. It gets caught up eventually. I don't get freaked out about this. But one of the things that is the media is going to get less diverse in the sense of urban concentration and class. I agree with you.
Yep.
Okay, so one thing I'm going to write about in the Dispatch, and it's not really linked to any particular news story, but there's not a lot happening in the news, and we got to put out a Dispatch. So we got to find some stuff to write about. There was a really interesting article at the Hub. The Hub
Yeah,
is a website that we're friends with the people there. We like them. They do some similar work to us, but they're much more, I would say.
Wonky.
Pardon me?
Wonky.
Yeah.
They're like a cousin publication, is what I would say.
Yeah. We have some overlap, but not a ton. And we're actually, I think we work well in concert with each other. We're punchy, they're wonky. but we do have some writers that overlap, right? When people want to get something off their chest, they come to us. When somebody wants to nerd out, they will usually go to them. Steve LaFleur, who's written for us before, wrote a piece for them recently where he's talking about airports, as I did about a month ago. And he's talking about the fact that there's no obvious scapegoat here. Like it's a mixture of government policy, it's a mixture of pandemic related issues, it's a mixture of private sector failures. I agree entirely with Steve. Like that was my conclusion, having done that recent jaunt, right? Like there are parts of it that I saw that were the government's fault. There were parts of it that I saw were the private sector's fault. I saw the private sector doing some things well. I saw the government doing some things well, blah, blah, blah. But I think what I'm going to write about is how there's an interesting nuance between blame and responsibility. And I think this is something that partisans don't want to admit and the public doesn't often grasp here. In governance and in politics, I don't necessarily care if it's your fault, if it's your job to fix it. And I think we would be better off from a perspective of civics, from society, if we understood that sometimes it's not your fault, but it's still your job to fix it. And that if the politicians themselves accepted that, as opposed to whining about this, like again, like just for another dash of Ontario politics here, I grew up in Ontario, right? There were people who were like teenagers and who had no living memory of Mike Harris, and the provincial Liberals were still blaming stuff on Mike Harris, right? Like at a certain, like, I think we need to basically have a rule in our politics by
10-year rule
for one term. If anything that is a problem in your second term is your fault, and anything that's a problem in your first term, might not be your fault, but it's your responsibility. And I think one of the things I just find so frustrating about Canadian public policy right now, I see you're getting an improvised tattoo there.
Yeah, I mean, it's always pass the buck time, essentially. Everybody tries to pass the buck.
And then we're shocked that things get broken. Like we talked about Toronto before. Toronto can't get the bathrooms open. Oh, bless you. Our waste baskets are constantly overflowing. Like,
this is simple stuff. This is simple municipal stuff.
This is also why Poilievre is going to win.
Yes.
And this is something you and I keep trying to tell people. This is not an endorsement of Poilievre. Like I'm, how do I describe this? I would say I'm currently agnostic on Poilievre. And I want to see when he is forced by circumstance to pivot from outrage to proposals.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I would say I'm resigned to Poilievre.
He might have worthy proposals, or he might just try to ride a tidal wave of outrage into office, which, by the way, could work.
Yes.
So I tell people all the time, doesn't matter what the jurisdiction is, doesn't matter what the right level of government is. Don't tell me that it's the previous government's fault. Don't tell me that other countries are having the same post-pandemic related issues.
Tell me what your plan is to fix this.
Fix it, and fix it fast, or else someone's going to use it against you.
Yeah, that's right, which is how this shit works. It's how the system works. One thing I would say is that I do think there's a blurb in me for Alberta politics, because it does look to me as if Danielle Smith is in the frontrunner's chair at this point. I mean, it has been a very disappointing race. And I kind of want to look forward a little bit, because if Danielle Smith winds up being leader of the UCP, I mean, I think there's a couple of questions that I have. One is whether or not she can actually control the caucus, or whether or not we're heading into a snap election because she can't actually gain confidence. The other thing that I would question is if her first big plan is to pass a Sovereignty Act, which with an explicit and a stated goal to cause a constitutional crisis. Okay, I can understand why that's emotionally fulfilling, but then what? What happens then? And
like I said, Poilievre, you got to pivot from anger to proposals.
Yeah, like, okay, so like, okay, so you cause a constitutional crisis. Good for you. And then what? Like, a constitutional crisis to what end? And, considering how much of Alberta's budget is generated from federal transfers, do you not think that anybody else is going to play this game? Do you not think that the federal government's like, all right, you're not going to enforce our laws? Fine, we're not going to pay your bills. Like, what are you going to do then? Literally, what are you going to do then? The other question I had, we're drawing on our face. The other thing I was going to, do you really think that if you start to provoke some kind of sovereignty crisis, that we're not going to suffer the same kinds of consequences. I mean, one of the ways that a lot of people respond to this, but respond to a lot of these things, say, well, we just want to do everything that Quebec is doing. I'm like, okay, firstly, you don't need the Sovereignty Act to do what Quebec has done. Secondly, you are aware the consequence for a lot of what Quebec has done was 30 years of economic stagnation and decline. So no, not the walls. No, not on the walls. On the paper's fine, not on the walls.
Joys of mothering.
These are, like I said, these are decisions and consequences. So like, do you not think that like prompting some kind of constitutional crisis and sovereignty crisis in Alberta is going to have an impact on whether or not serious companies choose to locate here? Like, but the major head offices are all gone, then they're not coming back. So like, what's your actual plan to build and grow the economic situation in Alberta and make it more sustainable in sort of a lower oil scenario, if this is the bullshit you're playing? Like, it just that would be kind of my takeaway from all of this, because that seems to be what this party is courting under Danielle Smith. And I understand where the anger is coming from, but sometimes doing things that is satisfying to the emotions isn't necessarily smart.
I wrote about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, because it was ahead of our last federal election, that one of the problems facing modern Canadian conservatism, and I wrote it about the federal party, and I'm going to ask you if this applies to Alberta, because I don't know. The problem Aaron O'Toole had strategically was that the person he had to be to become conservative leader was different than the person he had to be to become prime minister. That you have a small group you need to appease, you have a big group you need to appease, and you can't do both at the same time. So O'Toole ran as the true blue, tried to make the more moderate pivot, and it didn't work. What Smith is doing, as you say, probably is going to work on the UCP membership. How's it going to work on Albertans?
I don't know. I really don't, because there is obviously a selection of Albertans who have a very intrinsic distaste for progressives and the NDP and the socialists and blah, blah, blah. I think if there's any leader who has a good shot of being beaten by Notley, it's probably Smith. But I don't want to make, because I think Smith's got so much baggage. And not only just the floor crossing history and that baggage, not even the fact that, like, I'm not even sure if her caucus will work with her, but I mean, like, she's now been like a radio host for a number of years, and she kind of went Looney Tunes. Like, it's not going to be hard to find oppo baggage on her. Like, it's going to be greatest hits after greatest hits.
Well,
and I don't think that but I mean, like, I don't think that the general population of Alberta is as radical on COVID or politics or ideology as a lot of what she thinks they are. I think that polling data just consistently bears this out, that Alberta, even though it consistently votes conservative, isn't necessarily a particularly conservative. It's a upper C conservative province. It's not a small C conservative province, if that makes sense, right? And there are interesting historical reasons why that's the case. Jamie, mommy's talking right now. Yeah.
Attitudinal surveys tend to show that Albertans are more right wing than the median Canadian, but not
by a lot.
Massively so. Like,
not massively.
Like, you guys might be 10 to 20 points off the median, which is significant, but it's not 70 years uninterrupted conservative rule significant. That was work of local politics, not.
And it also depends. It also depends on the issue. When you talk about sort of social conservatism, and I think Smith actually does reflect this pretty well, because she's not a social conservative. But when you talk about social conservative, no, Albertans really aren't that much more conservative than Ontarians. Like, it's about there, when you talk about sort of fiscal conservatism, generally speaking, a little bit more conservative on that front, but then none of that's ever reflected in the policies of the parties in power.
Well, I say this with love from Toronto. I mean, you're in Toronto, so this is in a metaphorical sense with love from Toronto, even though I'm not there and you are. I think part of the problem is that Albertans have been bullshitting themselves.
Yes, that's correct. It's like they keep on thinking that they're fiscally conservatives, they take all the oil royalty revenue and spend the shit out of it. Like that, like essentially we bought ourselves 30, 40 years of labor peace by shoveling resource revenues into high quality services, and we have some of the best services in the country. But we don't pay for them. That's the problem. Like, we actually don't generate enough in our own tax revenue to cover our healthcare expenses. Like, that's it. Everything else comes from royalties in the federal government. Everything else.
Well, remember, Jen, what I'm always telling people: your expectations are a problem. And Albertans have come to think of themselves as the rock-ribbed, entrepreneurial, small business, fiscal conservatives. And then I look at your program spending relative to British Columbia.
It's through the fucking roof. And not only is our program spending through the roof, but also our revenues are actually a fraction as well. People, it's a long-standing beef in Alberta, where you have the left here sort of saying, well, our revenues are really low compared to British Columbia. And you have the right wing saying our program spending is really high according to British Columbia, and both of them think they have the answers. Like, it's both. It's both. You both don't take enough in taxes, and you spend too much. You fuck the dog on both sides. Like, I don't know what to tell you. It's that simple, And the answer isn't going to be one thing, because you can't cut program spending that dramatically under a short enough time frame, and you can't bring in revenue that quickly. So you're going to have to address the problem from both ends. And everybody privately, conservative and left, everybody who's actually in a position to understand this stuff privately,
they all agree. No, I know.
They all know that eventually we have to bring in a sales tax. They all know what the problem is. It's really, really obvious. It's so obvious, it's clear. You'd have to be a raging idiot not to see it. But publicly, none of them has to have the balls to do it, because they know that Albertans don't want to hear it.
Well, everybody's political future is invested in denying one of those two truths.
Yes, and basically just continuing to ride the royalty. So you wind up riding the royalty resource wave, and that's what we've done again. That's what we've done again.
Do it another 20 or 30 years, and you'll find yourself in a Toronto situation where everybody in Toronto knows that we probably need to narrow our service focus and raise our taxes so that we can be better at a smaller number of things. But everybody's political future is invested in pretending one of those two things is not true. So
I will say, Alberta, it's Toronto's property taxes
are really low.
No, they're crazy high.
Toronto property taxes?
I'm looking at your property taxes, for a comparable house. You guys are paying a fucking fortune. Our property taxes in Alberta is what, I can't remember what it is offhand, but it's something like 100 and something a month.
So your property tax is about what, $2,000 a year?
Yeah, about that, 2 to 3.
What would your house be worth on the market today?
Pardon?
What would your house be worth?
I don't want to disclose that on the thing, but I mean, our if you can cut this out. But
I will cut that out.
So of course, if you're factoring in the fact that our house isn't worth as much, sure, but
okay, Han. So I'm going to cut this part out. What I'm going to say to you now is that if we adjust for what you spent on your house combined with what my house would be worth, and then we adjust for our property tax, my property tax is about double yours.
Yeah. So, and so not only are you property tax double worth, but then when you start factoring in the fact that these houses are worth, $1, $2, $3 million fucking dollars, your actual annual property tax fees are what, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a year?
My property tax?
No, I mean the average person's property tax. That's.
I don't even know what the average is now. My personal property tax is about $11,000 a year.
That's the average property tax in Calgary is 2 to. You guys pay a fucking fortune in property taxes. And in fact, it's one of the big factors that I think makes Toronto totally inaccessible for people like me.
See, that's really interesting, because locally, Toronto actually pays low property taxes. The 905 communities all around us pay much more.
That's insane.
On a per capita basis.
That's a cuckoo could chew stuff, guys. That's crazy fucking high.
I'm curious now what kind of service levels are, though. What are we nominally funding that you aren't?
Probably transit's a huge part of it.
Transit, right? Police, fire, those are all enormous. Yeah.
We have excellent police services. We have excellent fire services. Our transit is not as extensive, I grant that. But also we have way more, we have actually huge road systems to maintain and shitty climates to maintain it in. So we've got to keep the roads plowed, right?
Yeah,
So like there's all that, like, and we've got some of the best library services in the country.
that's
Like
interesting.
like
We
what
should
like
maybe
what
get a municipal geek to actually look into this because I don't know.
like your property taxes are cuckoo gachoo high.
If I lived
Cuckoo
in the
fucking choo.
905 instead of the 416 in a comparably valued house, my property taxes would be much higher.
Yes, but I think also aren't they proper so high because the province has downloaded a lot of like social welfare spending to the
See,
cities?
this is
I
what I
think
want
that's a
to
huge
figure
part of
out.
it.
But I mean, that's
Yeah.
definitely a thing. But I'm curious because look, I mean, you're paying for it all anyway, but maybe you're paying it with oil revenues through the provincial treasury instead of what I'm paying.
No, we're not. Because I can tell you that very little provincial money actually goes into municipal. When it does go into municipal,
No,
it
but
goes for
what level of services are being covered at the provincial level that we are covering at the municipal level? Like health services, social welfare.
yes, health and social welfare are all provincial responsibilities, is what I would say. And
I mean, health is a provincial responsibility, but Toronto does a ton of like stuff.
You guys do a ton with public health and things like
Yeah.
that. Where Calgary doesn't really. I mean, Calgary's a public health officer, but like we don't really have like a public health department in Calgary, right? Like that's not
like homeless systems, things like that.
Good
I don't
question.
know.
I actually think a huge bunch of the homeless system is both provincial and privately funded, so it's charity. A lot of it's charity. So a lot of that's delivered more cheaply, I imagine. But yeah, I do think that Ontario, you're probably the reason why your property taxes are so high is because there's been a lot of downloading. But like $11,000 is fucking insane for property taxes. That is cuckoo fucking kachoo level insane.
It'd be 15 or 16 if I was living in the town I used to live in.
That's even more insane. Like, and like I said, I think our property taxes in Alberta are like seriously, it's like $2,000 to $3,000 a year.
I'm just doing mental math because I don't know exactly what your house would be worth, and I've cut out the bit of the audio where you revealed exactly what it is. But ballpark, my house would have triple or more of the value of yours on the resale market.
Yeah, about that. Yeah.
And the property tax is about double. So that's interesting.
But and I get that's why it makes it a really hard apples to oranges comparison, and I get also why that's why municipals structure them so you can't do these apples to oranges comparisons very easily. But I'd point out that your property tax alone makes Toronto inaccessible to middle class people because that is like nuts level of annual property taxes. That would be the equivalent of a middle class, like 20% of a middle class household's wage going into property taxes alone in Toronto.
Toronto is not for the middle class.
No, it isn't, and that's fine. But like, just wow.
What's interesting about, remember what I said at the beginning, though, that you've got hundreds of thousands of paper multimillionaires in Toronto don't have massive cash flow. So that actually has probably kept property taxes down to some extent in Toronto. Like my grandmother has lived in the same house since the early 1950s. She bought it for like her and my late grandfather bought it for like 10 grand. And it would be probably not quite $2 million these days, but probably not far off from that.
Mm-hmm.
My nonagenarian retired pensioner grandmother could not float the annual property tax increases if they were tracking with assumed retail value of the house, right?
No. So she has to defer, which is what they've done in Vancouver.
They just don't raise the taxes that much. She can cover what it is, but the property taxes don't track realistic resale values.
So in Vancouver, how they've coped with that problem is they've allowed people to defer their property taxes until they sell the house.
Sale. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, that makes sense.
Because otherwise it would simply be unaffordable for a lot of people to live there. They just couldn't handle it.
That's just interesting how you think they're so high when in Ontario it's always been how low they are.
They're so high.
Like if you raised Toronto's average property tax to match the Greater Toronto Area average, I think all of our revenue problems go away.
Yeah, but then you'd be paying, on average $15,000 to $16,000 a year in property taxes, and that is insane. That's insane.
Yeah, but think of how nice that park near my house is. It's fine. What do you want to write about in the Dispatch?
I mean, I wouldn't mind writing a little bit about Alberta and just like I think Alberta actually has a really interesting sale proposition for new arrivals. As I said sort of earlier in this dispatch, if you're a young family, I don't think there's a better place to be than in Calgary. But if it allows itself to get wrapped up in cuckoo Pachouville, which is what it seems like is about to happen, have fun with that. Just fucking have fun with that.
Why don't you write that as lead item? I can do a relatively short one after that about the strong mayor proposal and basically how keep an eye on Doug Ford, but just because it's his idea doesn't make it a bad idea. That could be a relatively short blurb. I'll do the blame versus responsibility thing. Anything else you want to say? Like we
Let's
can't
keep it
load.
short and sweet. Yeah.
There's not a ton to talk about right
It's
now.
July. It's July in Canada, man. Everybody's at the cottage.
Yeah. Okay. That's all I got. Oh, the Prime Minister
and
has
then
a new
we have
haircut.
something else coming on Ukraine. Yeah, Trudeau has a new haircut. We would like to add to the chorus that it does, in fact, look pretty stupid.
For anyone who's watching this on video, I, for a very good reason, do not make fun of the haircuts of other men. But yeah, it looked kind of, don't really know what he was doing with that one, but that's okay.
That was an error. That was an error in judgment. And I think that is enough said about the matter, and let's move on.
The only other thing I would mention was that this week, everybody was completely losing their minds one way or the other because Mr. Trudeau went on like a tourist steam train without a mask.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And it just it was just a microcosm of how stupid our politics are.
Yeah.
And it was, man is the worst prime minister ever for his hypocrisy. On the other hand, it was hero Trudeau unfairly maligned by post media. Guys, it was a completely banal, routine Trudeau public relations screw up. That's all it was. Was it good? No. Was it bad? Yeah. Was it a big deal? No. The partisanship. I mean, partially though, it's what you say. It's July. No one's doing anything, so people get freaked out about little stories.
Yep. Well, there's going to be big stories in a few more months. Only I think 41 more days till September, so we got more stories coming.
All right. Well, look, it's nice to talk to you again. I encourage you again to basically take next week off. I'll run the shop.
I might.
We'll thanks, everybody. Yes. Good to be back with you.
Yes.
Yes.
Can you say goodbye to everybody? Yeah. Say bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
We'll end it there. Thanks, everybody.